There is a particular cruelty that lives in rooms where the champagne costs more than a working person's monthly rent, and Nora Whitfield had spent 3 years learning its grammar. The people of Beacon Hill smiled with their teeth and not their eyes. They complimented your handbag and then asked, in the kindest possible voice, whether you'd considered a structured dress for your shape. For a long time, Nora absorbed all of it, the way a sandbag absorbs floodwater, because she believed that if she was useful enough, patient enough, small enough in spirit if not in body, she would eventually be allowed to belong. What none of those polished, predatory people understood, what they could not have imagined as they sipped and whispered and laughed, was that the most dangerous man in the city was standing in the dark at the back of the room watching the whole performance, and that within 3 months every one of them would learn to lower their eyes when Nora Whitfield walked past. The Harrington Library's annual benefit was held in the marble atrium of an old shipping magnate's mansion that had been gutted and gilded for exactly this purpose. Nora stood near a tower of oysters on crushed ice, painfully conscious of the square footage she occupied. She was 31 and there was no soft way to say what she was, so she had stopped trying to find one. She was fat, not in the temporary apologetic way that thin women sometimes called themselves after a heavy weekend, but in the permanent, structural way that meant strangers felt entitled to opinions about her lunch. Her dress was a deep wine-colored silk. She had altered herself at her kitchen table over 2 long evenings, because the boutiques on Newbury Street stopped nothing past a size 12 that wasn't built like upholstery. She had done the beading by hand. She thought it was beautiful. She had thought foolishly that tonight might be the night that mattered. She was only here for Trevor. Trevor Lansing was a vice president at Callaway Brandt, a wealth management firm whose clients owned half the harbor and most of the senators. He was 34, handsome in the way of men who have never once been told no, and for the past 4 years he had been, as far as Nora knew, hers. She had built the scaffolding of his entire ascent. She had reconstructed his firm's forensic models when his junior analysts botched them, because Nora was, beneath the soft, round face and the careful smile, one of the sharpest forensic accountants in New England, a woman who could look at a column of numbers and see the lie hiding inside it, the way a radiologist sees a tumor on a film. She had caught the errors that would have sunk 3 of his biggest accounts. She had never once been thanked in public. "You look flushed, Nora." The voice belonged to Sabrina Vale, whose cheekbones could have opened envelopes. Sabrina was a developer's daughter, all sharp angles and sharper smiles, the kind of woman who treated kindness as a tactical weakness in others. "Maybe sit for a bit. You've been on your feet." "I'm fine, Sabrina." Nora's cheeks burned anyway. "Trevor's about to speak." He was. The string quartet wound down, and Trevor took the small stage beneath the chandelier, immaculate in a tuxedo Nora had helped him choose. 400 people fell silent. Old money, new money, 3 judges, a congresswoman. Nora felt a swell of something warm and stupid and hopeful in her chest. Trevor thanked them all for coming. He talked about the future, about hard choices, about the courage it took to align your life with your ambitions. Nora smiled up at him. Then his eyes found hers, and the warmth in his face simply switched off, like a lamp. "For 4 years, Trevor said, his voice carrying easily across the marble, "I've been with someone who, and I say this with respect, simply does not fit the life I'm building." The room inhaled as one body. "Nora." He pointed. 400 heads turned. 800 eyes landed on her face, her arms, the wine silk she had sewn by hand. "I'm sorry, but I can't keep pretending. I need a partner who reflects where I'm going." And then, because cruelty, to be complete, requires an audience and a replacement, he extended his hand not toward Nora, but toward the front row, and Sabrina Vale stepped up onto the stage in a column of liquid silver, slid her fingers into his, and turned to face the crowd with the serene triumph of a woman accepting a trophy she had stolen. "Sabrina and I have been together for some time now," Trevor announced, unashamed, almost proud. "And I finally understand what a real partnership looks like." The silence cracked. It cracked into murmurs, then into something worse, the small wet sounds of people trying not to laugh and failing. They were laughing at her. Nora stood at the center of a spreading silence that was not silence, the heat of 400 faces pressing against her skin, and she could not breathe. She had paid this man's rent during his bar exam. She had sat up with him at 3 a.m. rebuilding the spreadsheets that saved his career. She had loved him without conditions, without ceiling, the way you love someone you've decided to spend your life beside. And he had used her public destruction as the opening act of his own coronation. She turned and pushed through the crowd. Nobody bothered to hide their amusement now. A woman in gold murmured, just loudly enough, "God, watch her go." I always wondered how long he'd carry that around. Nora's vision swam. She found a side door by instinct, shoved through it, and burst out into the freezing November night where a hard rain was coming sideways off the water. She made it as far as the alley before her legs gave. She put her back against the cold brick and slid down until she was crouched in the wet, the wine dress soaking through, her carefully pinned hair coming undone in dark ropes, and she sobbed in the ugly, full-bodied way she had never once allowed herself to be seen doing. She did not notice the black armored sedan idling in the shadows at the alley's mouth, exhaust curling white in the cold. She did not hear the door open or the unhurried footsteps come toward her through the rain. "Lansing is a coward." The voice was low and dark and absolutely certain, and Nora's head snapped up. A man stood over her, and somehow the alley's thin light seemed to bend around him rather than land on him. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a charcoal three-piece suit that fit the way only obscene amounts of money can buy. His hair was black and combed back. His eyes were a pale, glacial gray, and they were fixed on her with an attention so total it was almost frightening. She knew the face. Anyone who read a newspaper in this city knew the face. Lucien Moretti. He ran the waterfront. He ran the unions, the freight that moved through the harbor at night, and, if half of what people whispered was true, a fair number of the men who decided which warrants got signed. He was less a person than a rumor with a tailor. "Go away," Nora said, swiping uselessly at her ruined mascara. "Wasn't tonight enough of a circus for everybody?" Lucien didn't go. He drew a folded white handkerchief from his breast pocket and held it out, patient as a statue. "I don't find loyalty being butchered in public entertaining, Miss Whitfield. I find it offensive." She stared at the handkerchief, then at him. "How do you know my name?" "I know everything that moves through this city." His voice was unhurried. "I know Trevor Lansing just stood on a stage and humiliated the woman who built his career to make himself look decisive. And I know you're already deciding to disappear." "I am," she said, snatching the handkerchief. "I'm going to pack a bag and leave Boston and never look at a single one of those people again. Running confirms the story they're telling about you." He crouched, bringing those gray eyes level with hers, and the rain hissed against the back of his coat. "It tells them they were right, that you were always something to be discarded." A spark of anger cut clean through her grief. "You don't know anything about me. You have no idea what it's like to walk into a room and watch every single person decide what you're worth based on the size of you." "No," Lucien admitted, "but I know what it is to be underestimated, and I know exactly how to make the people who do it regret it for the rest of their lives." He rose and extended a hand. "Stand up, Miss Whitfield. I have a proposition for you, one that ensures Trevor Lansing, Sabrina Vale, and every soft-handed parasite in that ballroom will never look down on you again." 10 minutes later, Nora was sitting in the worn leather cabin of his car, a tumbler of something amber and expensive burning a line of heat down her throat, listening to a Mafia boss explain that he needed a wife. The federal task force had a name now, he told her, and a leader, a humorless prosecutor named Walter Krause, who had built his career on the promise of putting a Moretti in a cell. Krause was assembling a RICO case, and the whole architecture of it leaned on a single image. Lucien Moretti as a violent, lawless, unmarried predator, a danger to the city that judges had a duty to surveil. As long as that image held, the wiretaps kept getting signed and the noose kept tightening. At the same time, a rival operation run by a man named Declan Burke was probing the edges of his territory, smelling weakness. And this concerns a forensic accountant they just laughed out of a benefit. How exactly? Nora asked. Optics, Lucien said. If I marry a model, the feds see a transaction, a trophy. It proves their story. His gaze moved over her, not unkindly, but with the flat assessment of a man reading a ledger, and then returned to her face. But you are the precise opposite of what the world expects a man like me to choose. They will see only one explanation: love. It is the one thing Kraus cannot subpoena. She should have been insulted. Some part of her was. But there was a second reason, and Lucien laid it on the table between them like a card he'd been holding. There is also the matter of my books, he said quietly. Kraus has a forensic team 3 weeks from finding a pattern I would prefer they not find. I have accountants. I do not have anyone who thinks the way you do. I read your deposition in the Halloran fraud case 2 years ago. You found a $6 million lie that 4 federal examiners had walked straight past. He held her eyes. I am not offering you a costume to wear. I am offering you a partnership, your name beside mine, and your mind inside my operation, and in exchange you will be untouchable. You will never again wonder how to pay for anything, and I will hand you the ruin of Trevor Lansing on a plate. Nora looked at the leather portfolio he slid across to her. A 2-year contract. It was insane. She restored her grandmother's recipes on Sundays and read biographies of dead queens for fun. She was not built for a war. And if I say no, then I open the door, Lucien said without heat, and you walk to South Station and you go back to a life where people treat you like furniture, and Trevor Lansing becomes a state senator inside of 5 years. The image rose unbidden. Trevor's switched-off face, Sabrina's silver triumph, the wet laughter. Something that had been sleeping at the bottom of Nora for 31 years woke up and stretched. Society had decided her worth was a number on a clothing tag. Why on earth should she keep playing by society's rules? She picked up the heavy fountain pen, flipped to the last page without reading the rest, and signed her name in a single hard stroke. A flicker of genuine respect moved through Lucien's pale eyes. Welcome to the family, Mrs. Moretti. Over the next month, Nora's life was taken apart and rebuilt around her. She was moved out of her cramped Somerville apartment and into a fortress of a house on the North Shore, all stone and glass and silence, with a security detail of 2 enormous men named Bruno and Thomas who followed her like armed weather. Lucien was a ghost in his own home. Gone before dawn, locked in a soundproofed study until midnight, visible only during carefully staged public appearances. They were photographed at dinner at a restaurant where the menu had no prices. They were spotted walking the public garden, his hand at the small of her back. In front of the cameras, he looked at her with a warmth so convincing that her own treacherous heart sometimes stumbled over it. In private, he was courteous, distant, and entirely consumed by his war. But the city's reaction, when the engagement ran in the Globe, was an earthquake. Beacon Hill lost its collective mind. Nora's phone, the same phone that had gone silent the night of the benefit, detonated with messages from women who had stepped over her on the way to the bar. Nobody could compute it. Nora Whitfield, the fat girl Trevor Lansing had thrown away on a stage, marrying Lucien Moretti? The rumor mill spun straight off its axle. She was blackmailing him. She was carrying his child. He had suffered some sort of breakdown. No one, not one of them, could conceive of a powerful, beautiful, dangerous man simply looking at her and choosing. Trevor took it worst of all. He cornered her one grey afternoon outside the rare book shop in the South End where she still insisted on doing the accounts 2 days a week because she refused to become a woman with nothing of her own. What is this, Nora? He stepped into her path, frantic, his careful composure gone. Is this some sick game to get back at me because it's not funny? Before she could answer, Bruno's hand closed over Trevor's shoulder with enough force to make him yelp. Take your hand off my wife, Mr. Lanson." The voice came from the car. Lucien stepped out, unhurried, adjusting one cuff, and crossed to them. He wrapped an arm around Nora's waist, around the full, soft curve of it, and drew her against his side as though she were the most natural thing in the world to hold. "Lucien," Trevor stammered, the blood draining out of his face. "You can't be serious. You don't know what she is. She's nobody. She's my fiancée," Nora said, and her own steady voice surprised her more than it surprised either man. She leaned into Lucien's warmth, into the solid wall of him. "And unlike you, Trevor, he keeps his promises. Now move before my husband decides you're loitering on his patience." Lucien's chest moved with a low, dark laugh. He bent and pressed his mouth to her temple, and a kiss lingered a half-second past anything a performance required. "You heard her, Lansing. Walk away. And if you come near her again uninvited, they won't recover enough of you for a closed casket." Trevor practically fell over his own feet getting down the block. Nora watched him flee, a tide of vicious satisfaction rising in her, and waited for Lucien to drop his arm and resume being a stranger. He didn't. He kept it there, warm and certain. "You handled that well, Tesoro," he murmured. "I had good backup," she said, though her heart was slamming against her ribs, and she understood, with a small cold lurch, that the most dangerous thing about Lucien Moretti was not the gun she knew he carried. It was the way he looked at her like she was already someone who took up exactly the right amount of room in the world. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in December, and Lucien did not believe in restraint. He rented the entire Cathedral of the Holy Cross. Nora braced herself for the indignities she'd learned to expect. A battalion of stylists, a corset, the grim project of compressing her into something the cameras could forgive. Instead, Lucien flew in an old Florentine couturier named Madame Bianchi, who arrived not with a tape measure held like a verdict, but with armfuls of silk and lace and tulle the color of fresh cream. "Mr. Moretti was very specific," Madame Bianchi said, walking a slow circle around Nora with the eyes of a painter sizing a canvas. "He said you are not to be hidden. He said you are to be set like a stone in a ring. We are not here to make you smaller, Cara." She smiled. "We are here to make them understand they are looking at a queen." When Nora finally saw herself in the long mirror on the morning of the wedding, she wept. The gown was ivory duchesse, satin with an off-the-shoulder neckline that displayed rather than disguised the lush sweep of her shoulders and collarbone, cinched at her natural waist before falling into an enormous, architectural skirt that moved like weather when she walked. It did not make her look thin. It made her look sovereign. Lucien stopped in the doorway. He was in a midnight blue tuxedo, looking like something dredged up out of an old and dangerous stream, and his pale eyes traveled from the thin diamond circlet in her dark hair all the way to the hem of the gown, and for the first time since she'd met him, Lucien Moretti was struck silent. "I look like a mob wife," Nora joked, her voice unsteady, reaching for anything to break the tension building in the room. He crossed to her slowly, stopping only when there was no space left to cross, and lifted one rough hand to trace the bare line of her shoulder. A shiver ran the length of her spine. "You look like the only thing I've ever wanted to protect," he said, and the rawness in it was not in the script. The cathedral was packed to the vaulted ceiling. Lucien had instructed his consigliere, Enzo, to send invitations to everyone who'd been in that marble atrium the night Trevor put her on display. They came, the socialites, the developers, the woman in gold, and 4 rows back sat Trevor Lansing and Sabrina Vale. Dressed to be seen, having come, Nora was certain, only to watch the joke unfold. When the organ swelled and the great doors swung open, the entire congregation rose and turned. Faces already half arranged into the expressions you wear when you expect to witness something embarrassing. Then they saw her. Nora walked the long aisle with her chin level and her spine straight. The ivory satin gliding over the old marble, and a sound moved through the cathedral that was not laughter. It was the soft collective intake of several hundred people being wrong at once. Women who had spent 4 years narrating her body to each other stared in furious, helpless disbelief. As she passed the 4th row, she let her eyes touch Trevor's for exactly 1 heartbeat. Every drop of color had drained from his face. He was not looking at her with pity. He was looking at her with the dawning, ruinous comprehension of a man watching the best thing he ever held walk past him forever. Beside him, Sabrina's silver dress had gone, all at once. Cheap. Lucien waited at the altar, and when she reached him, he took her hand and turned it over and pressed his thumb to her pulse, and she felt him steady at the contact. When the priest said the words and gave him leave to kiss her, Nora braced for the chaste, choreographed touch they had practiced. Lucien did not follow the script. He framed her face in both hands, slid his fingers into her hair, and kissed her like a man laying claim to the only thing he intended to keep, deep and certain and entirely unconcerned with the 400 witnesses. Nora gasped against his mouth, her hands flying to his lapels, and kissed him back with a heat that startled them both when he finally drew away, his forehead resting against hers. The cathedral was utterly silent, and Nora understood that something that was supposed to be theater had quietly, terribly become true. What followed should have been the calm before the storm, and for a few weeks it almost was. Nora moved her work into Lucien's world. She sat at the long table in his study with 12 years of ledgers spread before her and did the thing she did better than nearly anyone alive. She found the lies. She traced the pattern Krause's people were 3 weeks from finding. And then she did something Lucien's own accountants had never managed. She unwound it. She built, line by patient line, a clean and defensible architecture beneath the operation's legitimate fronts. A structure so coherent that the federal forensic team would chase its own tail for a year. Lucien stood behind her chair past midnight watching her work, and the look on his face was no longer assessment. It was something closer to wonder. "You see it all at once," he said, "the whole shape of it." "It's just patterns," Nora said, not looking up. "People think numbers are cold. They're not. Numbers are the most honest confession a person ever makes. They just don't know they're confessing." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, Trevor never knew what he had. "No," she said softly, "he didn't." And while she worked, she had begun, almost idly at first and then with the focused patience of a surgeon, to pull on a different thread. Because Trevor Lansing's career rested on the same kind of architecture she could read in her sleep, and Trevor Lansing had been cutting corners for years, and Nora Whitfield had personally rebuilt the very models he'd used to bury his own fraud. She knew exactly where the bodies were. She had, in fact, helped him bury several of them, back when she still believed he'd marry her. It was Declan Burke who broke the calm. Burke had been watching the wedding, the headlines, the sudden untouchable stability of the Moretti name, and he had understood, correctly, that a married and respectable Lucien was far more dangerous than a lone and reckless one. So Burke did what cornered men do. He found the weakest point in the wall, and the weakest point was a desperate, ruined, vengeful man named Trevor Lansing, who had recently begun to suspect, correctly, that his new wife's old fiancé was quietly dismantling everything he owned. They took her on a Thursday, in the grey hour after she left the bookshop, before Bruno could get the car around the corner. A van, a hood, a needle. And Nora woke to the smell of rust and standing water, zip-tied to a steel chair in the middle of a derelict cannery out on the harbour flats, with the wind screaming through broken glass and Trevor Lansing standing in front of her looking like a man who had finally, fatally run out of road. "You're going to call him," Trevor said, his voice shaking, his eyes red-rimmed and wild. "You're going to tell him to back off Burke and to make those files I'm being investigated over disappear, and then maybe, this ends with you walking out of here." Behind him stood Declan Burke, calm where Trevor was frantic, and 4 of Burke's men with rifles, and Nora understood with a clarity that surprised her that she was not afraid of dying. She was afraid of one thing only. "He's going to come," she said. Her voice did not shake. "And you have no idea what you've done." Trevor crossed the floor and struck her across the face, hard enough to split her lip against her teeth. "Shut up! Shut up! You were nobody. You were nothing. He's using you the same way I used you, you stupid." He never finished the sentence. The lights went out. Not flickered. Died, the whole grid. The cannery dropped into pitch black, and then the world came apart at the seams. There was a sound of the loading doors like a freight train hitting a wall, and muzzle flash strobed the dark. And Burke's men were shouting and then not shouting and then not shouting, and through it all, Nora sat very still in her chair and felt something she could not name. Not relief, exactly. Recognition. She had told them he would come, and he came. When the gunfire stopped, the silence rang. Emergency lamps stuttered on. Burke's operation lay finished on the wet concrete around her, and across the vast floor came Lucien Moretti in a tactical vest, a rifle hanging from a sling. His pale eyes lit with something that had gone all the way past rage into a cold, clean wildness. Burke himself was on his knees with Thomas's gun at the base of his skull, and Trevor was on the floor, curled into a trembling ball among the shell casings, sobbing in high, broken hitches, having understood at last and far too late exactly what he had reached into. Lucien did not look at either of them. He crossed the floor in long, grounded strides and dropped to his knees in front of her chair and drew a blade from his thigh and cut through the ties at her wrists and ankles in 2 fast, surgical motions. "Nora," he said, and the word came out of him like something torn loose. He pulled her against his chest, his face buried in the curve of her neck, and the most feared man in the city. A man who had walked into a kill room 60 seconds ago without his pulse changing, shook. His hands moved frantically over her arms, her back, the full curve of her waist, checking, needing the warm, solid fact of her. "I'm here," she whispered into his vest, breathing in cordite and cold air and him. "I knew you'd come. I told them." He drew back just far enough to take her face in both calloused hands, and his thumb stopped dead against the hot red welt blooming along her cheekbone where Trevor had hit her. The air went still. The desperate husband vanished, and in his place rose the other thing, the thing the whole city was afraid of. Lucien stood up slowly, the lethal calm pouring back over him like cold water, and turned to face the sobbing heap of Trevor Lanson. "Lucien, please." Trevor pressed his face to the concrete. "Please, Burke made me. I owed him. I didn't want to take her. I'll leave. I'll leave Boston. I'll never." "You brought my wife to a slaughterhouse," Lucien said, and his voice was quiet, almost gentle, which was infinitely worse than a shout. "You tied her to a chair, and you put your hand on her face." "You took everything from me," Trevor screamed, finally lifting his ruined, snot-smeared face. "She was supposed to be nothing. You were just using her like I—" "No," Lucien said, "I never was." He did not draw his sidearm. He looked down at Trevor with an expression scrubbed clean of anything resembling mercy, and then he said the worst thing he could possibly have said, which was the truth. "But the gun would be a kindness, and I am not feeling kind." He turned to Enzo, who had appeared at the edge of the lamplight. "He spent years stealing from people who can't afford lawyers. My wife has the proof, all of it. By Monday, the SEC, the IRS, and the Bureau will each receive a very thorough package." A thin, terrible smile. Trevor Lansing is going to spend the next decade learning what a cage feels like, with his name in every paper, with Sabrina Vale long gone the moment the money stops. He'll have years to think about this room. He crouched, just for a moment, level with the broken man. Living was always going to be the punishment. You simply didn't know it yet. Then he turned his back on him entirely, which was the cruelest thing of all, and crossed to Burke. What he said to Declan Burke he said too quietly for anyone else to hear, and Burke, who had never in his life been afraid, went the color of ash. Lucien returned to Nora and lifted her into his arms. All of her, easily, like she weighed nothing, like she was precious, and carried her out across the carnage and into the biting dark, where the car was waiting warm on the cracked lot. He wrapped her in a cashmere blanket and held her against his side the whole way home, and the only sounds were the engine and the steady, even drum of his heart beneath her ear. Hours later, scrubbed clean under scalding water until the smell of the cannery was gone, Nora came out of the steam in a soft silk robe and found Lucien sitting on the edge of the enormous bed, looking, for the first time, undefended. The shadows under his eyes were deep. In his hands was a heavy sheet of cream-colored paper she recognized at once. The contract. The 2-year agreement she had signed in the back of his car when she was a soaked and broken thing in an alley. Her heart seized. She walked toward him slowly, more frightened now than she had been with the gun in the room. Had tonight proven she was a liability? Had the kidnapping shown him she was too much weight to carry? "Krause is finished," Lucien said quietly, not lifting his eyes from the page. "Your work made his whole theory collapse this morning. Burke is fleeing north. The narrative holds. I am secure." He turned the paper over in his hands. The marriage served its purpose. Nora swallowed hard and made her voice level. "I understand. I suppose my end is fulfilled too. Trevor's ruined. The people who laughed at me will never meet my eyes again." Lucien finally looked up, and the intensity in his pale eyes pinned her where she stood. Slowly, deliberately, he gripped the top of the contract. He tore it in half. Nora gasped. He fit the pieces together and tore them again, and again, until the legal binding of everything between them was nothing but a handful of confetti, and he let it fall to the dark floor. "I don't want a contract," he said, his voice rough with something he was no longer trying to govern. He stood and closed the space between them and took both her hands in his. "I don't want an arrangement. I don't want an asset, Nora." He lifted her hands to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a desperate reverence. "When I saw you in that chair tonight, when I understood I was seconds from losing you, every dock and union and dollar I own meant nothing. Less than nothing. I don't want any of it if I have to live in this house without you in it." "Lucien," she breathed. "I think I loved you the moment you looked up at me in that alley, soaked to the bone, and told me to go away." The most dangerous man in the city stood entirely bare in front of her. "You are the smartest, bravest, most beautiful person I have ever known, and I have spent my whole life around people who confuse cruelty with strength. I want this to be real. No exit clause, no expiration. Be my wife. Actually be my wife. Forever. Forever." Nora looked down at the torn paper scattered across the floor, and then up into the face of a man who had seen every single part of her, the parts the world had spent 31 years telling her to apologize for, and decided she was a treasure worth going to war over. Her whole life she had tried to take up less space, to fold herself smaller, to make her existence convenient for people who would never have done the same for her. Standing in Lucien Moretti's hands, she did not want to be smaller. She wanted the whole world. "I love you too," she whispered, and a wet, radiant smile broke across her face. "But you should know something, Lucien. I have an enormous appetite. For all of it. For everything. I take up a great deal of room, and I'm done shrinking to fit anyone." He laughed, a real one, deep and astonished. A sound that chased the last of the dark out of the room and pulled her flush against him, his hand settling with reverence into the generous curve of her hips. "Then take it all, Nora Meyer," he murmured against her mouth an instant before he kissed her. "Take every inch of it. The whole damn city is already yours." Boston society never entirely recovered from the shock of her. They had tried to bury Nora Whitfield beneath their tasteful jokes and their narrow, cruel arithmetic of worth, certain she would fade into a sad and forgettable footnote. Instead, she rose out of the wreckage of her own humiliation to become something none of them had the imagination to predict. Trevor Lansons went to federal prison with his name in every headline, and Sabrina Vale, true to her nature, Vanished the week his accounts froze, and Nora took the blunt, frightened instrument of Lucien's empire and rebuilt it, line by clean and brilliant line, into something untouchable, ruling it with a mind sharper than any blade her husband owned. She had spent her whole life being told that power belonged to women who could disappear into a size 0. She spent the rest of it proving that real power comes from somewhere else entirely. From knowing precisely what you are worth, demanding it out loud, and being loved by someone willing to burn the world down before he'd let anyone tell you to make yourself small again. For a long time, I believed the story Trevor told about me on that stage, that I was something to be carried, tolerated, eventually set down. I watched Nora believe a version of it too, and what I keep coming back to is how long she let other people do her arithmetic for her. They added up her dress size and called it her value. They were wrong, and the proof wasn't that a dangerous man chose her. The proof was that she stopped letting the wrong people hold the pen. What I learned watching her story unfold is that nothing in it happened by accident. Trevor humiliated people for years, cut corners, stepped on anyone softer than him, and the cannery floor he ended up sobbing on was simply the address all of that finally arrived at. Lucien spent his life learning to read people and protect what mattered, and so when it counted, he came. Nora spent 31 years sharpening a mind nobody bothered to look at, and that same mind is what dismantled the men who underestimated her. Cause and effect, we are all, eventually, standing on a floor we built ourselves. Brick by quiet brick. I think about the 3 things that actually saved her, because none of them was luck. The first was that she refused to become cruel even when cruelty was handed to her. She won by being precise and honest, not by becoming Trevor. There's a kind of strength in keeping your hands clean that the world mistakes for weakness right up until the moment it doesn't. The second was her mind. She didn't wait for a rescuer to define her. She did the work. She found the lie inside the numbers. She made herself the most valuable person in the room because she had spent years becoming exactly that. And the third was the plain, stubborn refusal to disappear when every signal told her to. She got hit, she got mocked, she got left in the rain, and she stood back up each time, soaked and shaking and still unwilling to fold herself smaller. That's the part I want to hold on to. You don't get to choose whether people misjudge you. Trevor will always exist. The room full of polite laughter will always exist. What you get to choose is whether you keep your character when it would be easier to abandon it, whether you keep growing the one thing nobody can take, what's between your ears, and whether you stand up one more time than you get knocked down. Nora didn't conquer that city because a man loved her. A man loved her because she was already the kind of person worth crossing a war for. The love was the consequence, not the cause. And I think that's the quiet thing nobody tells you when you're the one being laughed at. In your handmade dress, the size of your life was never going to be decided by the size of your body. It was always going to be decided by how much of yourself you refused to shrink.